So I simply titled this talk Postgraduate Education because when I asked Sue for the brief, she said, just talk about postgraduate education and why it's important. So she's already given you a sense of my background, but I put it here because I had a bit of a Tinswalo moment. I don't know if you remember the president's Tinswalo speech last year, for which he was heavily criticized. But it suddenly occurred to me that I have been in the higher education sector for the past 30 years. So a real Tinswalo, a child of the New South Africa, so to speak. I graduated from matric in 1994. And so since then, I have spent my life, the first 10 years being a student and the next 20 years working in higher education. So this is all I know. So I put this up not to give a biography of my life, but also to make some disclaimers about some of the views that I hold. For example, I know that higher education is part of a much broader PSET sector. So we have here, for example, our representatives from private institutions. We've also got our regulatory bodies, we've got our funders, we've got our policymakers, etc. And so a lot of what I'm going to share is not going to touch on that because of my own biases and my own background and what work I've done before. It's just to acknowledge that I do recognize those blind spots, and should you hear certain biases, this is probably why those biases are going to come across. So why higher education? So for me, I'm always troubled by the narrative that sets up a binary between the public good and the private good of higher education. And I subscribe to the view that says that given our challenges as a nation, with the triple challenge of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, it would be unrealistic not to recognize higher education as a very powerful tool, first and foremost for upward mobility, which then contributes to social justice and advancement. I think it is proper that higher education should do that. The second one is that it gives those who embark on higher education the skills, the knowledge, and the know-how to participate effectively in the social, the economic, the political, and the cultural life of a nation. And I think this point here is very important as we think about the role of postgraduate education and how we want, or we ought to, at least as universities, to cultivate a sense of a critical and engaged citizenry. And then the last one, which I'm most enthusiastic about, of course, is the role of higher education in knowledge creation. Generation of new knowledge. So why postgraduate education specifically then? Because the first slide was about higher education. Well, if done correctly, I think it has a great ability to train citizens who can conduct sound research, leading, of course, to generation of new knowledge. They can refine existing new knowledge and apply it in innovative ways. They can engage in scholarship work, development of new innovations, and perhaps critically sustain the higher education system. I was very pleased to note in one of the CHE briefly speaking notes that when we look at the distribution in terms of age of the academics in South Africa, we seem to be okay. About 25% young, which is under 35, about 55% or so, 35 to 56, And then the last 10 years, which is about 56 to 65, again, another 25% or so. So I think we are okay there, but we must acknowledge that we do have people exiting the system, pursuing other interests. We do have people exiting the system, going into retirement. And so even as we think about postgrad education, we need to think about how we are going to replenish the system and how we're going to sustain the system. Then I'm always reminded at Rhodes University that not everything that matters can be counted. And so even as we think about postgraduate education, we like to think that the experience of going through a master's and a doctoral degree entrenches this deep sense and culture of being inquisitive amongst our graduates, which can have spin-offs for people that are open to debate, that are free to explore new ideas, and are not threatened by difference. This then has spin-offs for tolerance, for social justice, and really a better understanding of the world, not only from a unique disciplinary perspective and depth, but more broadly, humanity and the socioeconomic challenges, as well as the socio-ecological challenges that are facing us at the moment. Of course, master's and PhD graduates usually find jobs as captains of industry. They are highly competent technical leaders. They are managers of complex systems because of their skills base, community builders, and we expect them to be thought leaders. And so I thought, let me also reflect on what are some of the continental, national, and institutional drivers in this quest for postgraduate education. You will notice that I will flip-flop between saying postgraduate education and probably doctoral education as the apex qualification, but please have at the back of your mind that I do intend to also talk about masters as well. So at a continental level, the AU, last year we have the Continental Strategy Documents, which is AU 2063, the Africa We Want. And last year it entered its second 10-year implementation plan. So the first 10 years are gone. And at the beginning of the 10 years, starting last year, the AU made a very bold statement about how it considers doctoral education in particular to be a great enabler for socioeconomic development of the continent. And linked to that, there's this really bold, ambitious plan to produce 10,000 PhD graduates per annum within the next 10 years. 10,000 PhD graduates per annum in the next 10 years, which really then begs the question of how is the continent going to do that? And in the context of preparedness, how are we going to prepare for that? And can we deliver on that? And how should we be preparing to deliver on this big and bold and ambitious continental plan? The second one, which you are highly aware of, is of course our own national ambition of being a knowledge-driven economy, which is articulated in our National Development Plan. And it cascades into all of our planning instruments that we get from DHET as well as the CHE, with 3 critical indicators linked to postgraduate education within that National Development Plan. The first one is that we as a country intend to have up to 25% of all enrollments in our public higher education institutions as the target for, we intend to engage 25%, to enroll 25% of all students in higher education as postgrads. We also have another ambitious target of producing 5,000 PhDs per annum. At the time that the NDP came on stream, we were producing, I think, around 800 PhD graduates per annum. And it was argued that the knowledge that gets generated out of higher degrees can help our nation become more innovative and uplift people economically. The third indicator, when it comes to the NDP, which is our national ambition, has to do with the qualifications of academics within our institutions, being 75% PhDs within the higher education sector. And so this is what we want to do as a nation. Of course, back in the early 2000s, the Department of Science and Technology and the National Research Foundation launched the South African PhD project, which was aimed at really driving this idea of doctoral education within our nation. And so it became a platform for doctoral education. I think many people in this room will remember the annual conferences, the South African PhD conferences that we used to hold, really intending to increase the number of South Africans with PhDs. This we did in combination with many funders, both at home and abroad. And there were three different modalities of PhD education at that time, which are still here. PhD at home, PhD abroad, and also PhD in split site. The PhD abroad, of course, is very expensive, and it costs about 3 times as much as it would to train somebody here at home. And yet, one must appreciate and acknowledge that there is great value in placement of PhD students for a time, at least a period of time, at an institution abroad, and that exposure is really quite useful for PhD students. It was also a hub for mentoring and also for increasing the diversity of mentors. I am very pleased to see ACRES and the TUSO resources have now taken over insofar as providing mentorship platforms. But I do note that as a nation, we no longer have, a conversation, a buzz around PhD education, which those annual conferences used to give us, because we used to gather once a year at least to really just focus on all matters doctoral education. And that seems to be missing in the system at the moment. Our institutions also care very much about postgraduate education. I use the Rhodes University example. Our institutional strategy is called an Institutional Development Plan, or Umkombandlela, which is the Zulu word meaning campus, which is meant to show us the way and the direction. And within that, of course, you will have many different goals. And ours is goal number 4, which speaks to all matters research. But what I wanted to highlight here is the fact that there are 15 objectives linked to this goal, which speaks to strengthening the university's positioning as a research-intensive university. And 5 of them refer to postgraduate education. And now I absolutely cannot see. Asipha, may I please ask you to pass me my glasses? I can't read my own slides. I wanted to refer to the grey bits. Number 4 is providing development opportunities. So number 2 is improve academic staff qualifications with a particular focus on doctoral qualifications. Again, that speaks to, before we can talk about postgraduate students and postgraduate education, we must talk about those who will be training the students. And so this whole concept, of course, is premised on the idea that a doctoral qualification prepares one for postgraduate training, for offering postgraduate training, which may or may not be true. But it helps as a starting point to have that doctoral qualification. It's almost your license to trade. Then number 4 is providing development opportunities for supervisors, including training and student supervision. So that is in recognition of the fact that people may have PhDs, but they still need to be supported and to be trained to prepare them for postgraduate education. Of course, we all obsess about the 6th one, which is increase the proportion of postgraduate student headcount enrollment. I think this goes for all our universities. I was deliberate about this. This is not really about Rhodes University. If I go and I look at the strategic plans of all our 26 universities, you're going to see very similar things, which again comes to the point that Sue was making earlier, which is given that we're all trying to do the same things, what is preventing us from coming together and collaborating in order to achieve the things that matter to all of us, and in any case, that are cascaded from the national level? Well, once you have the students, you need to ensure that you've got funding for them. So we need to worry about financially sustainable mechanisms for funding postgraduate education. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Strengthen our Center for Postgraduate Studies. Again, major drivers in the higher education system of support for postgraduate students and preparing postgraduate students. And then, of course, expanding opportunities to participate in mobility programs, which are spoken about, the importance of ensuring that students get opportunities to go elsewhere. Enrollments, and within that, the swear word efficiency. Obviously, we all have our targets, and our councils are very interested in these figures. Once a quarter, we must account for what's happening with our postgraduate enrollments, what is our plan to get more postgrads in, and I guess the question is, once we've got them in, how are we preparing them to succeed so that we can respond to this issue of efficiency? I must say, having been one of those, I would say, very narrow and straightforward trained people. You know, I stayed at varsity from first year all the way to PhD without exiting the system. I used to hold the view that there's absolutely no reason why one shouldn't finish their master's in 2 years, and there's no reason why they shouldn't finish their PhD in 3 years. But I must say I'm starting to be converted in caring about the quality of the student that one is producing within those time frames. Obviously, I'm not going to go to my counselor and say I think it should be N+2 or N+1, but I do think we need to really think, and that is part of what I'm hoping that the discussion will be about today. How do we then ensure that the quality of the training that we provide within those 2 or 3 years is such that we can have students that have the graduate attributes that are intended within the different frameworks from the CHE. Obviously, everybody cares about this, your postgraduate enrollments at honors, masters, and doctoral levels, and then the red figures, of course, are where you're falling short and always having to account for this. But the reason I put this here is not to show how we're not meeting our enrollment targets, but to actually say this becomes highly contentious. Because if we are to accept that there is an intention, nationally at least, and on the continent, to increase our postgrad enrollments, how do we then within our institutions manage these under-enrollments? Because then it starts to push us into the conversation around performance management for academics, for which there are various appetites across the system. There are institutions that have embraced performance management and it is not a problem. There are institutions that are heavily unionized and will not hear of this. And there are those institutions that just think it is inappropriate to even have this discussion about how to manage the performance of academics. And so how do we then, in the absence of performance management, have healthy conversations about what our expectations are of our academics, because of our academic colleagues? Because we do talk later on about postgraduate supervision and the capacity for postgraduate supervision, which doesn't only talk to the ability of people to supervise, but also speaks to the numbers of people available or not available to do supervision. How do we handle this conversation? What are the kinds of compacts that we ought to have as colleagues within a university? I'm really interested in hearing how colleagues are managing that in their respective spaces. Then, of course, another driver for postgraduate education is the world of rankings. You like them if you participate, you don't like them if you don't participate. I especially like the title that says Rankings are Rubbish, and why Rhodes University refuses to play. But there are many other institutions now globally that have decided to abandon participation in rankings. Again, this is important because, like it or not, flawed or not flawed, students do care about rankings. In fact, parents care about rankings. They care about where they send their children, and the first place they look at is how is this university ranked before they send their children anyway. And so, in the absence of rankings, what can we put on the table? All right, so these are some of the drivers for postgraduate education within our national and continental context. So I thought, let's look at how we're doing then, given that 2030 is a good 48 months away. Postgraduate students or enrollments to constitute at least 25% of all enrollments. We are currently sitting at about 16%. And I read the documentation from last year's Colloquium, and this number has not changed in about a decade. So how are we going to do this? I do not think it's likely that we'll get to these targets by 2030, but what can we do? Given that this is a national imperative and it's important, how then should we be approaching postgrad education, and what is the role of preparedness in that conversation? We're doing well, I think, with PhD graduates per annum, given that around the year 2000, we started at about 800 PhDs per annum. We're now currently sitting at about 3,690. There's an expression it's called unsensitega. I don't know what it is in English. It's like moving really slowly. It's like moving uphill and then sliding down backwards and back up. I think unsensitega when it comes to the qualifications of academics nationally. Only about 48.8% of academics in our institutions currently hold a PhD. So I thought, okay, let's also look at some of the trends over the past, let's say, 20 years or so. I think the size and the shape of the higher education sector is very well known to the group of people sitting around the room. So that's not really what I want to look at. But the first thing I wanted to highlight was the enrollment trends. So you can see that from about 1994, we had about just under 500,000 students enrolled in our public higher institutions. And we're currently sitting at about 1 million now. So they've doubled. And the 2030 target in the NDP is about 1.6 million students in the higher education sector. On the right-hand side, though, you see postgraduate enrollments over time, which just shows that our postgraduate enrollments are not growing. So what's really happening here? We've got increased enrollments overall, but very stable percentages of enrollment of postgrads in the sector. So we'll have a look at that. We also have a trend where there's increased academic collaboration and cross-border student mobility within our continent and beyond our continent. I spoke earlier about the three modalities, at home, abroad, and in split site. We do seem to be having a challenge, and I'm also looking forward to having a discussion around how do we handle the issue of equivalence with SAQA, because we are the only nation on the continent that has an honors degree. And this really constrains us when we need to admit master's students who have completed four-year qualifications in their home countries, submit their qualifications to SAQA, and get an equivalence of NQF level number 7. How do we handle that? I think the short answer is usually that Senate is the highest decision-making body on academic matters. Let Senate decide, and then Senate often decides to go the RPL route, which is not always appropriate. And so how are we to really meaningfully deal with equivalence within the continent? Because if we're driving postgrad numbers, I imagine that we want our own students, and by that I mean students graduating from our own institutions. We also want to circulate amongst ourselves, so we are looking to attract other students from elsewhere within our nation, but we also want students from the rest of the continent and elsewhere in the world. In fact, it is noteworthy that a third of our doctoral graduates come from the rest of the continent. So how are we to work with this? Because if we really need to bring students into that master's level, then this is something that needs attention. I just thought I'd also acknowledge initiatives like CATA, as well as AIMS, which are African hubs of postgraduate training. The Aroa Centers of Excellence as well. I think we've got about 16 across different universities on the continent, and they're all geared towards making the ambition of a thriving postgraduate body on the continent a reality. So what's happening then, given that the numbers within the sector have doubled, but over time, we seem to be hovering and stuck around the 16% mark. The first idea is that our students are taking long to complete. So I want to marry the efficiency argument with the support argument. And I think that if we provide effective support, and perhaps if we prepare appropriately, ourselves, our institutions, our supervisors, and our students, perhaps we can turn around the figures around completion times. High attrition rates, a lot of the students that start their master's and doctoral degrees do not complete. In fact, I read that about 51% of all students that start a PhD do not complete it. So that's huge wastage within the sector. I already mentioned the fact that a third of our PhD enrollments and graduates are from the rest of the continent. And I think this is good. I think it's good that we are a hub for doctoral training on the continent. So some of the stubborn issues in our sector, a small size of postgrad enrollments, broad base of honors and PG dips of Black students entering postgraduate education, which is not reflective of their proportion in the general population. So we'll talk about the other four at the bottom in a bit. Another shift that we've seen is that towards inter, multi, and transdisciplinary focused research. I think the Global Compact around sustainable development goals has been very useful and helpful in this regard. So the Sustainable Development Goals, you get a lot of calls now, both at home and abroad, international funding, that compel us to speak to how the research that we carry out, and therefore the type of postgraduate students we're training, contribute to answers around some of these stubborn challenges. And of course, we have industry partnerships and innovation-driven agendas, which also demand that we must talk about the issue of impact when it comes to postgraduate education. However, there are also opportunities here for intra and inter-institutional collaborations, team supervisions, postgrad courses, which we've been talking about for quite a while. I've been following, for example, the writings of Sue McKenna for the past 10 years, and the issue of training postgrad students as cohorts of students, which has now recently found expression in the doctoral review that was carried out in 21 and 22. This issue has been around for a long time, so I'm interested in knowing, why aren't we just getting on with it? What are some of our own behaviors as institutions that stop us from actually implementing that which we agree in theory is good and will take us forward? We've also been experimenting with the idea of institutional research themes. These are not unique to Rhodes University. They've been around for a while at different universities. Some universities call them focus areas. Some universities call them niche areas. They also are very useful in fostering collaborative working arrangements, at least in theory. We are starting to see some new challenges linked to inter, multi, and particularly transdisciplinary work. So even as we're starting to, or we're intensifying the conversation around impact and contribution to sustainable development goals, there is a challenge now in that a lot of examiners seem not to have the requisite competencies and knowledge to actually examine transdisciplinary work. I think it has long been a complaint when it comes to the NRF reviews, for example, of projects and ratings particularly, but we're now starting to see it when it comes to thesis. So what are we to do about this? There are also, I think, tensions in the things we articulate as things that we want to do, like to collaborate, and the ways in which we incentivize, we recognize, and we distribute resources, even within our institutions. Because our structures, including promotions, by the way, our structures of recognition and reward the individual. And they don't reward collaboration. And so if we really are going to start moving in the direction of collaboration, cohorts, team supervision, committee supervision, we're going to have to deal with this. Because you can't, on the one hand, say you want to do this, and then on the other hand, reward something different. So, part of why I agreed to give this talk and why I was keen to attend was the bullet point number 3 in terms of the aims of this colloquium. Because I'm interested in what cultures, policies, infrastructures, and resources are essential for creating institutional environments that nurture postgrad education. This at least is the dimension that I have control over. I think, it's within my sphere of control. And I'm interested in knowing how do we allocate resources? How do we reward? How do we recognize? What do we need to put in place? How do we shift attitudes from personal very highly personalized spaces. You see them in the way we celebrate our A-rated, B-rated academics, how we all pursue research chairs, but those also tend to be highly specialized types of instruments and highly personalized types of instruments. So how do we leverage personal excellence of academics within our spaces for greater and effective institutional ecosystems that are also thriving, so that when Kwezi, the individual, leaves who holds the research chair, the whole thing doesn't fall flat. So I'm interested in how we navigate these things. Interestingly, there is also now, you will recall, at the end of 2023, the president announced a 5 billion rand initiative for postgraduate training, specifically doctoral training, in 6 different areas, which are listed at the bottom there. And then there was a communication from the NRF at the beginning of the year that sensitized institutions that there will be a call coming out to respond to this presidential PhD program. Now, the interesting thing here is that it's very explicit about the type of features that doctoral program should have. So the work should be transdisciplinary and collaborative. It should better accelerate socioeconomic impact. It must have industry stakeholders. It must have international partnerships. And interestingly, there have got to be clear pathways of absorption of the PhD graduates into industry, into the academy, into policy making, and into entrepreneurship. And I think for most of us, this is uncharted ground. So how are we going to do this? Because there's only going to be 6 of these hubs. And because this is going to be partly taxpayers' money, there has got to be participation of all the 26 universities. So even as hubs will be located at, I would imagine, 6 different universities, there have got to be spokes elsewhere within the country. And so we all need to make it our business how we're going to make this happen. And then there's also talk of transferable skills, networking, critical experiences. And these critical experiences relate to things like time abroad. They relate to things like publishing while still a PhD student. But they also talk about another range of skills like systems thinking, transdisciplinary research, leadership, etc. How are we going to ensure that each hub doesn't have its own set of transferable skills that they are putting on the table? So I think this is going to really need a lot of national collaboration and coordination amongst ourselves, and no one's going to come and do it for us. We're going to have to do this for ourselves, because all the NRF is going to do is give us a call and say, respond to this call. It's also interesting, Sue, that you were talking about how the framework is talking to opportunities for collaborating, because I note that the NRF sent out notification that they will be discontinuing competitive support for unrated researchers and competitive support for rated researchers, which are individual grants, which we normally link postgrad students and postdoc students to, in favor of thematic areas. So it looks like kicking and screaming, whether from the national level or international, we are going to have to wrap our heads around the issue of collaborating. All right, I think the next keynote will talk a lot more about digital transformation and innovative modes of delivery. So I just wanted to say that there are opportunities here for virtual and hybrid master's programs, but we will need support in terms of what the frameworks for quality and accountability will look like, even as we expand our postgraduate offerings by making use of virtual platforms and digital technologies. I then wanted to just touch on the last four stubborn issues in postgraduate education, being student funding, inadequate supervisory capacity, and the preparedness of students, which is what will be discussed at great length here today and tomorrow, and the lack of adequate support services for postgrads, as captured in the recent paper by Saidi and various other papers in the same issue of the South African Higher Journal of Education towards the end of last year. So around 2015-16, when there was Fees Must Fall, the focus was really around undergraduate funding. And so subsequently, whether rightly or wrongly, or whether there was a plan or no plan, the NSFAS was greatly expanded and catered for more students. But what concerned us at that time and what continues to concern us now is that there doesn't seem to be a comprehensive framework for funding of postgrad education in South Africa. So we don't know how to support financially needy students who are entering postgrad education, because the NRF can only fund about 10% of all students enrolled. And so what about the rest of the 90% of students enrolled for postgrad? I'm not even talking about enrolled overall, but enrolled for postgrad. So we do need to have a plan. We also do rely, of course, linked to research projects that are internationally funded. We rely on international funding. But what is really going to happen now that we've got all of these geopolitical tensions? Just as an example, last week we received, I'll call it a request to be polite, but really it was a demand from the EU to say we must declare that there will be no Russian collaborators on a particular project that's funded by the EU. Now, how do you sit with that as part of BRICS, and sign that? Of course, it's said to be at the project level, but in reality, I think we are all going to receive those letters relating to each one of our EU-funded projects to take aside what's going to happen with all of our funding streams from the US and what are the implications for postgraduate education as grant funding is drastically cut. So that's another thing that we have to worry about, because you cannot speak on the one hand about expansion of postgrad numbers without speaking about a corresponding increase or provisioning of funding. Some of the other persistent challenges, I think, we speak a lot about insufficiently qualified supervisors, student ratios to supervisors, inconsistent supervision quality. I think we talk a lot about this, and I'm sure it was covered last year. But I thought perhaps one of the things that we don't consider is a lot of us have honorary, emeritus, adjunct, and visiting professors on our books. We've got numbers and numbers and numbers of them. And we seem to be very happy to list them on our publications and to claim subsidy. I know that Johan Mouton is doing extensive work in that regard. But I think here is an underutilized source of postgraduate supervision capacity. Of course, it would have to work very closely with institutional mechanisms for monitoring the quality of that supervision. But I think this is something that we can do. And also perhaps to look at joint appointments of researchers that are sitting at and working at science councils, just as an idea. So these are some of the, this was a summary slide, and some of the key institutional mechanisms that are driving change in the postgraduate education space, and I will not repeat them, that was just to summarize. And I think one thing that I certainly did not have when I was a student 20 years ago was the ecosystem of postgrad support that is currently available to our students. I mean, I know that one of the stubborn challenges is said to be insufficient support, but I think there is so much support available to our students relative to what used to be available in the past. Perhaps in conclusion, I think in addition to everything that I've talked about, I think I would call for harmonization on the continent, attention to qualification equivalence. Given that a lot of what's being put on the table in terms of collaborative programs for M&D, we do need to look at that framework of internationalization for higher education, because right now it's very difficult to implement with the provisions that are made in the policy, particularly as they relate to joint degrees. Something as simple as what will the certificate look like? The policy said it has to be a single certificate that lists both institutions. You speak to your partners and they are not able to release their safety features of their qualification to you so that you can co-badge. And so you're ending up with two different certificates that must be read in conjunction. If that is the case, then the policy must change and acknowledge that as it stands, it is difficult, if not impossible, to implement. Sue again spoke about collaborative national programs, which we are looking forward to. There are some great examples like SAMOS, which is a South African Marine and Ocean Sciences Master's Program. I think it includes at least 11 of our institutions, but we are currently stuck on how to transfer the credits amongst ourselves. So I think the HEQSF framework will be helpful in this regard. And of course, the big elephant in the room is always how we should have a mechanism so that we can realize a differentiated higher education system in South Africa. Because right now, we all do the same things because those are the things that are funded.
Yeah.
So I'll stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah.